The central nervous system is made up of two parts, and the first part is what we call the brain, and then what we call the spinal cord. The spinal cord is made up of 5 regions. We have what we call the cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, sacral region, and then coccygeal region. All of them together, they give us what we call 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Good evening to you all. My name is TUMNAD, and today's video we are going to be looking at what we call the cross-section of the spinal cord. And during this study, we are going to be cutting this spinal cord transversally, and then we look at it on top like this. Okay, that's the study we are going to be looking at. And mainly we are going to be looking mainly of what we call the anatomy of the cross-section of the spinal cord. We are going to be looking at how do we call all these different structures that you're going to be seeing on the cross-section of the spinal cord. Okay, so now, but if you have not yet subscribed, please make sure you subscribe, you turn on the notification bell so that whenever I load a video, you're the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what you call the cross-section of the spinal cord. Okay, looking at this diagrammatic illustration, it is showing us a cross-section of the spinal cord. We want to see how do we call all of these different structures. Okay, so now starting with number one, you see the whole of this structure, which is like H-shaped, this kind of this structure, it is more of a gray. Okay, it looks more of gray. It's going to be housing a lot of neuron cell bodies, both for the case of the sensory and then for the case of motor. The whole of this structure, which is H-shaped, is what we call the gray matter. Okay, is what we call the gray matter. Okay, so now number two, the whole of this structure, which is white. Okay, all of these areas where you're seeing white. The fact that is white, it is also called white matter. Okay, it is called white matter, and it's white matter because it is going to be containing neuron axons. Okay, you're going to be having different axons which are going to be moving up and then down. We shall see them later in what we are calling the dorsolateral and then the ventral columns. Okay, that's going to be our number two. So we are going to be having generally the white matter and then the gray matter. We shall come later in detail and see what is going to be contained in the gray matter and then the white matter. Okay, so now that is our number two. Then number three. Now, number three is going to be part of the gray matter. But of course, this side is going to be the posterior part, and this is going to be the anterior part. Okay, so now for that reason, this area of the gray matter, which is at the back, which is at the posterior, we just simply call it posterior. You may even call it the dorsal gray horn. Okay, you may even call it the dorsal. You may call it the dorsal horn. You may even call it the dorsal gray horn. Okay, you may even call it the posterior gray horn. You may even call it the sensory. You may call it even the sensory gray horn. It depends on what you want. Okay, that is our number three. So now coming to number four, the fact that this one is going to be at the posterior and this one is the anterior, we just change. This is going to be the anterior gray horn, or you may even call it the ventral gray horn, or you may even call it the motor gray horn. The moment any that you feel you want. So, but me, I'm going to call it the ventral horn. Okay, the ventral horn. You may even add the word gray because it's going to be part of the gray matter. Okay, so that's number four. Then coming to number five. Number five, you see this bulbar structure, which is going to be now like in the part of the gray matter. We are going to be finding some of these structures. They are going to be in what we call the thoracic region and then the lumbar region, and they are going to be housing neuron cell bodies that give us preganglionic fibers of what we call the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so now the sympathetic nervous system on the spinal cord, they come out from what we call thoracolumbar region. Okay, it means that these bulbar structures in the cervical region, we may not see them. Okay, so now how do we call this structure? This kind of the bulbar structure, part of the gray matter, is what we call the lateral horn. Okay, is what we call the lateral horn. You may even call it the lateral gray horn. What you want is what you put. Okay, that's number five. So now coming to number six. You see this number 6, we have number 6A and we have number 6B. But number 6 generally is going to be the whole of this tube. Okay, the whole of this tube. This tube and this tube, they are the same. And this tube plus this tube, they are also the same. So now, how do we call this, the whole of this tube? The whole of this tube is what we call, the fact that is at the back, or that is at the dorsal part, we are calling it just the dorsal root. Okay, we just call it the dorsal, root. Okay, we just call it the dorsal root. Now, the dorsal root is going to be housing a lot of sensory fibers. Okay, we're going to be having sensory neuron fibers that are going to be coming from the peripherals. They pass through what we call the dorsal root, and they enter into what we call the sensory horn. What you're calling the dorsal horn. So now this one is going to be what we call the sensory neuron. Okay, this is going to be our sensory neuron. That's our number 6B. Okay, now coming to number 7. Number 7, you're going to be having 7A, and then you're going to having 7B. Now 7A is going to be the whole of this tube. Okay, the whole of this tube. The fact that it's going to be at the anterior part, or it's going to be at the ventral part, we just simply call it the ventral. We simply call it the ventral root. As simple as that, the ventral root. And this ventral root is going to be having neuron fibers, because that it is going to be originating from what we call the ventral horn of the gray matter. You're going to be having neuron cell bodies coming out through this ventral root, and they come and join up here. We shall come and see what this structure is called later. But this one is going to be now the sensory neurons. Okay, it's going to be now the sensor. It's going to be it's going to be the motor. It's going to be the motor neuron. Okay, it's going to be the motor neuron. Now, we have very many kind of motor neuron fibers that are going to be passing through what we call the ventral root. We have some of these fibers, and we are going to be calling them, we have what we call the alpha motor fibers, and then we also have what we call the gamma motor fibers. They are all going to be coming out from what we call the ventral horn of the gray matter. Then for the case of the thoracolumbar region, we also have some of the neuron cell bodies which are going to be in the lateral horn. So now these ones are going to be giving us what we call the autonomic fibers. Okay, and mainly they're going to be giving us what we call the sympathetic motor fibers. So we are going to be also having what we call the sympathetic. We're going to be having the sympathetic motor fibers coming from the lateral horn, and they also come out through the ventral root, and then they go and unite. We shall see how this structure is called. Okay, so now that's going to be our number 7, having motor neurons, where we have the alpha, the gamma, and then the sympathetic, or what we call autonomic fibers. All are going to be passing through this ventral root. That is our number 7. Then coming to number 8, you see this number 8, we're going to be having this kind of bulbous structure, this dilated structure. It is even also this side, okay? It is going to be on the dorsal root, but this structure is going to be housing neuron cell bodies, okay? Sensory neuron cell bodies. The fact that you're going to be having a collection of the neuron cell bodies inside here, this dilated area. You know, a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system is what we call a ganglia. So now, the fact that it's passing through what we call the dorsal root, so we just add the word ganglia, so it becomes the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, this one becomes the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, it is just as simple as that. So now that's going to be our number 8. Okay, now coming to number 9, you see this number 9, you're going to be having a lot of the white columns on this side, this side, this side, and this side. So now how do we call the white columns which are going to be on this side? The fact that it's going to be at the lateral, we may even call it the lateral white columns, but we have another beautiful name for this, and this one is going to be our, you may call it the lateral, you may even call it the lateral funiculus. Okay, the lateral funiculus. And this lateral funiculus is going to be housing a lot of what we call the tracts. what is a tract? A tract is going to be a bundle of axon fibers, okay? A bundle of axon fibers in the central nervous system. We call it a tract, okay? We're going to be having ascending tracts, and we're going to be having also the descending tracts. The ascending tracts, they are going to be more of sensory, and then the descending tracts are going to be more of motor. So now when we look at this one, which we are calling the lateral funiculars, we are going to be having what we call the spinothalamic, okay, spinothalamic tract, and even also we may have what we call the spinocerebellar tracts. All these tracts are going to be they're going to be moving both up and down, okay? And for that reason, the spinothalamic is going to be more of sensory, and then what we call the spinocerebellar is going to be more of motor. And of course, for the case of sensory, it's going to be moving up, and then for the case of the motor, it's going to be moving down. As simple as that. So now this is going to be now a lateral funiculars. And then number 10 is going to be at the back, okay, at the dorsal part at the posterior end. So we simply call these ones with the white columns here, we simply call them the dorsal. You may even call them the dorsal funiculars, okay, dorsal funiculars, the dorsal funiculars, okay, the dorsal funiculars. And then, of course, for the case of the dorsal funiculars, you may even call it the posterior funiculars. You may even call it the back funiculars. Here we are going to be having the ascending tracts. Okay, we are going to be having the ascending tracts. We may have some of the tracts like what we call the fasciculus gracilis, and then fasciculus cuneatus. Okay, these are some of the ascending tracts which are going to be having in what we call the dorsal funiculars. That's number 10. So now coming to number 11, we again also have these kind of the white columns here in the anterior part. So now for that reason, these ones which are going to be on the anterior part, they are going to be called the ventral. They are going to be called the ventral funiculars. Okay, ventral funiculars. And for the case of ventral funiculars, we're going to be having what we call the reticulospinal tract. We're also going to be having what we call the vestibulospinal tract. So now here we're going to be having even more of the descending axons and suddenly a little bit of what we call maybe the ascending axons. Okay, so now it's going to be our number 11, the ventral funiculars. You may even call it the anterior funiculars. Okay, now that's number 12. Number 13. You see the whole of this structure here, this number 12, the whole of this kind of the groove, this kind of this depression. This kind of depression is what we call the ventral, median, is what we call the ventral median fissure. Okay, the ventral median fissure. Okay, ventral median fissure, and this one is going to be housing more especially what we call the spinal artery. Okay, this one what we call the ventral median fissure. That's number 12. Now coming to number 13 at the back. Of course, we're not going to be having the fissure this side. We are going to be having what we call the sulcus. So now this number 13 is going to be now what we call the dorsal median sulcus. Okay, the dorsal median sulcus. That's going to be now our number 13. Okay. Now coming to number 14, you see this kind of the central area, this central area of the gray matter. This area is just simply called the central canal. It's called the central canal. Okay, it's going to be the middle kind of the tube, which is going to be located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. We just simply call it the central canal. Okay. Now coming to number 15. You see the whole of this ventral root and then the dorsal root, when they come and unite together, they make one of the most important structure. And how do we call this kind of this structure, which is going to be through the union of the dorsal root and then the ventral root? This kind of this structure which are going to be forming from this point here going down, this is what we call a typical spinal nerve. Okay, what we call a typical spinal nerve. We are going to be having in this typical spinal nerve, you're going to be having the sensory part, and then we're also going to be having the motor part. Okay, we shall come later and see how these spinal nerves are going to be moving from this spinal nerve into another kind of the tubes which we are calling the dorsal and then the ventral rami. Okay, just going to be now our next video in just near future. Okay, so now this covers the cross section of the spinal nerve. Let's just have a very quick recap of what we have just said. We said that we have just brought a cross section of the spinal cord whereby you just cut it transversally and you're looking at it from the top. This is what we are going to be seeing. We said our number one is going to be the whole of this H-shaped structure, which we are calling the gray matter. And then you're going to be having the white matter, the whole of these white areas. Okay, on the lateral sides, the posterior side, and then the anterior side. So what we call the white matter. Going to be having different axons which are myelinated. That's our number three. Our number two. Then we came to number three, which we call the dorsal horn of the gray matter, and then number four, which is going to be the ventral horn of the gray matter. Okay, and then we said number five is going to be now the lateral horn, mainly on what we call the thoracolumbar region. It's where you're going to be finding this kind of the lateral horns. Okay, that's number five. Number six, I said this is the whole of this tube here, and this tube here is what we call the dorsal root. Okay, and then we have the sensory neurons which are going to be passing through what we call the dorsal root. And this kind of the sensory neuron is going to be more of the pseudo unipolar neuron. Okay, because it's going to be having what we call the peripheral process and then the central process that enters into the spinal cord, and then of course the lateral cell body. It's such a beautiful thing. Okay. Now, coming to number seven, we said number seven, the whole of this kind of this root, okay, the whole of this root is going to be anteriorly. We just simply call it the ventral root, and it's going to be having a lot of the motor fibers. We have what we call the motor neuron fibers, like the alpha, the gamma, and then the sympathetic or even autonomic motor fibers, mainly on what we call the sympathetic nervous system that comes out of the spinal cord through what we call the thoracolumbar region. Then we went to number eight. We said that this kind of this bulbar structure, which is going to be housing neuron cell bodies. We said the collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system is what we call a ganglia. The fact that is on the dorsal root, we simply call it the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, and then we said number nine, those are going to be the columns, the white columns, which are going to be on the lateral sides, the posterior side, and then the anterior side. We simply called this one as the lateral white column or lateral funiculus. Okay, and then for the case of the lateral funiculus, we said we have what we call the spinothalamic. We have also what we call the spinocerebellar tracts, and of course we said that a tract is going to be a band of axons which are going to be either moving up, ascending, or descending down. And then we said number 10 is going to be now the dorsal funiculus, and then number 11 is going to be the ventral funiculus. We said number 12 is going to be the ventral median fissure, which is going to be housing what we call the spinal array. Okay, and then we said number 13 is going to be now our dorsal median sulcus, which is going to be at the back. And then number 14, we said that this canal, the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, and then lastly, we said that the dorsal root and then the ventral root, when they come together and they form what we call a typical spinal nerve. And of course, a typical spinal nerve, later we shall have it split into the dorsal rami and then the ventral rami, going to supply different areas. We shall come later and extract and see how a spinal nerve is going to be splitting into the dorsal rami and then the ventral rami. Okay, I'm sure what I've just talked is adding something to you, and if you think it is adding to you, are benefiting from it, why can't you like the video, comment down in the comment section, share the video to the people you think that this video is going to be adding something, and at the end of it all, make sure you subscribe. Thank you very much for listening. It has been TUMNAD from the beginning up to the end, and as always, until we meet next time.